Hello, Gary Mrozinski here, and we are going to continue with Chapter 8 of the Macroeconomy today by Schiller and Gebhardt, published by McGraw-Hill. We're going to develop a model of the macroeconomy that we then can use to discuss and evaluate the effects of fiscal policy and monetary policy. So we'll be using this model for the rest of the semester. First, let's talk about the macroeconomy. There are certain determinants of economic activity, and there are certain outcomes that we measure to see how the economy is doing. So let's first talk about the determinants. As I said, we will be developing a demand curve and a supply curve, which rather than representing the demand and supply of a specific product or industry, it will be representing the demand and supply of all goods and services in our economy. This is known as aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We will graph them together and, as I said, use this then to have our policy discussions around fiscal policy and monetary policy. Let's start with the demand curve. Aggregate demand. This is the total demand for all goods and services in our economy. So it's made up of the demand for everything at different price levels. See, the one complication here is on the x-axis we still have output instead of, it's not the output of one specific market, which would be measured in terms of units of the product demanded and supplied. Now it's the output of the whole economy. So on the x-axis we are going to have dollars. because how do we measure the output of the whole economy? Gross domestic product, GDP. So we will have GDP on the x-axis. On the y-axis, normally we would have the price, right? Dollars, the price of the product. Well, now this is the price of every product that is bought or sold in our economy. So what is the one aggregate measure of overall level of prices that we can use on the y-axis instead of dollars? Price index, that's right. So then what we're looking at when we are discussing the aggregate demand curve is the total aggregate quantity demanded at any given price level. And it will have a downward slope, as our demand curves to this point have had in individual markets. Now let's talk about aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is the total quantity of goods and services that producers are willing to bring to market at different price levels. And so across the x-axis, we have total output, just like we do when we're talking about an individual product market. This is the overall economy we're talking about now. So we measure output in terms of GDP. So we have dollars on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, instead of dollars, we have price level. We don't have we're not measuring the individual price of a product, we're measuring overall level of prices, so we use price index. So as the price index rises, producers are willing to bring more products, greater quantities of goods and services to market. And so it's an upward sloping curve, just like it is in an individual market. And the explanation for that is very similar to the explanation for the upward sloping supply curve in an individual market. There are two reasons that it is an upward sloping curve. There is the profit effect, which means, other things equal, if only the price of your product rises and your costs are not rising, which is implied, then you're more profitable and you would want to produce more. You would want to bring greater quantities of the product to market. This is known as the profit effect. This is a good time for me to point out the fact that GDP, when we measure it, we are measuring output prices, or prices of final goods and services. We are not measuring prices of intermediate goods or raw materials. We are measuring prices of final goods and services. They call them output prices. And so the price index that we have on the y-axis is a price index measuring output prices, or prices of final goods and services, because that's what GDP is measuring. Now, cost effect, this is also an explanation for why the aggregate supply curve slopes upwards. Costs increase over time, just like output prices increase over time. Producers, because costs increase over time, will only supply greater quantities of product if the price also rises to cover those added costs. And so this is also an explanation for why we have an upward sloping supply curve. There are the curves. On the left, you can see aggregate demand. And again, across the bottom, across the x-axis, we have output of the economy measured in dollars. That's GDP on the x-axis. On the y-axis, instead of an individual price for an individual product, this is all goods and services, so we need to use a price index, which represents all goods and services. But again, that price index is measuring output prices, prices of final goods and services, not the prices of intermediate goods or raw materials. And on the right, you can see the supply curve, which is upward sloping. This is probably a good time for me to, even though this is not in this chapter and it's not even mentioned in this course, why is it that that supply curve is a curve and not a straight line? Sometimes we draw it as a straight line. It more correctly is drawn the way you see it here. And the reason is, imagine that there is a demand curve crossing that supply curve. Now imagine that the demand curve is shifting to the right for some reason and gets to the point where the supply curve, the intersection now is where the supply curve is rising more steeply. What happens is, if there's enough of an increase in overall demand, aggregate demand, shifting to the right, since our economy has some maximum capacity to produce goods and services, which is the sum total of all goods and services that all producers are able to produce, there is a maximum amount. It's not indefinite. If the supply curve had been a straight line at a 45-degree angle, then that would imply that there's no upper limit to what our economy can produce, but there is. So you can see it starts bending and gets more steep, and it's approaching some upper limit of GDP. So again, across the x-axis you have GDP. There's some amount of maximum GDP that our economy can produce. Maybe today it might be something like, I don't know, $25 trillion. We just don't have, that would be if we had 100% of our workers working and 100% of all of our other productive resources being employed. We can't produce more than whatever our theoretical maximum would be, and so the supply curve has to shift upwards that way to sort of represent that limit. And as I said, you won't be responsible for understanding that in this course, but I usually get that question in class. Why are we calling it a curve when we usually draw it as a straight line? Well, it really is a curve, the supply curve. And the demand curve has a little bit of a curve to it too, but I won't get into that right now. When we introduce both curves in the same graph, just as with an individual product market, we have an equilibrium point. We call this macro equilibrium, where aggregate supply intersects with aggregate demand. And if you follow that down to the x-axis, remember that's GDP, that will be the equilibrium output of the economy. That will be how much the economy is actually producing. Now follow that equilibrium point, the intersection, across to the y-axis. You see P sub E. P means price level or price index. P sub E means equilibrium prices. So then over time, equilibrium prices rise, or if they do rise, then the rate at which they're rising becomes the inflation rate. But that's what that is. That's the price level or price index. And so what could make prices rise? When one of the curves shifts to the right or to the left. Now the other thing to look for, on the x-axis I already mentioned Q sub E is equilibrium output. That's the amount of GDP we're actually producing. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. If you see on the x-axis Q sub F, like you do in this case, Q sub F means full employment level of output. Now you remember from chapter 6 that full employment is not 0% unemployment rate. It might be more like 4% unemployment rate. That's considered a reasonable goal. We'll never get to 0%, but if we get to 4%, we'll say that's full employment level of output. Well, there's some amount of potential GDP that is full employment level of output. What would GDP be if we were only at 4% unemployment rate? Now in this case, Q sub E, that's what we're currently producing, that's less than Q sub F. That means we are producing less than the full employment level of output. So that means we would want to increase GDP, Q, to get to Q sub F. So when you see these graphs of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, whenever you see Q sub F on the x-axis labeled somewhere, just know that that is your goal. You want to get to full employment level of output. In this case, what we're actually producing, Q sub E, is less than that, so that must mean we have high unemployment, or at least unemployment that's higher than 4%, because if we had unemployment of 4%, we would be producing a larger amount of GDP, Q sub F. Let's talk about what might make the supply curve shift. Aggregate supply. What if business costs rise? That would cause a decrease in aggregate supply, an overall decrease in aggregate supply. If business costs were to rise, like if energy were to get more expensive, like if the price of oil were to rise. What if we raise taxes on businesses? That makes it more expensive to operate, and that would lead to a decrease in overall aggregate supply. What if there's a natural disaster or a pandemic? This is exactly what's happening now. Decrease in aggregate supply, the whole curve shifts to the left. What might increase aggregate supply, make it shift to the right? If business costs were to fall, and that actually has happened in our economy, energy has gotten less expensive, and natural gas is part of that. Business taxes, well, we've discussed this already. We lowered the corporate tax rate. Why do we do that? Because we're looking to shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. And by the way, when that happens, if we move from AS sub 1 to AS sub 0, shifting to the right, look what happens to GDP. We would go from Q sub 1 to Q sub F. That increases GDP. And then my favorite one, bountiest harvests occur. So this would be the opposite of a natural disaster, which might affect the agricultural markets. If you have a very good growing season, then that's part of the supply curve, right? Agriculture is part of the supply curve. That would shift it some to the right. Let's talk about what might shift the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve might shift to the left, so that will be a decrease in overall aggregate demand if spending decreases in the economy. So that could be either consumer spending decreasing on its own, or maybe caused by fiscal policy, or a decrease in government spending, which would be probably a form of fiscal policy. We'll talk about all that in the next chapter. But in general, if spending decreases, that's a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the left. If the spenders, consumers, expectations get pessimistic about the future, that's really causing the first bullet, causing a decrease in spending. That would shift the demand curve to the left, just like it would do in Chapter 3 for individual product market. If the government were to increase taxes, that forces a decrease in spending to a certain extent, doesn't it? Because it takes income away from consumers. That would shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. What might increase aggregate demand? Spending increases, either by consumers on their own or maybe caused by the government lowering their taxes, or if the government themselves were to increase spending as a form of stimulus. So in each of these cases, this is fiscal policy. Or it could just be that consumers' expectations about the future, their financial expectations, are improving, and that would also shift the aggregate demand curve to the right because that causes them to spend more. So what happens when the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve shifts? Well, that moves the equilibrium point, right? The intersection. And think about if that intersection point, that equilibrium point, shifts horizontally to the left, that makes GDP go down, doesn't it? If it shifts horizontally to the right, that makes GDP go up. If it shifts to the left enough, that could be a recession. If it shifts to the left but then starts shifting to the right, something that we might try to do with fiscal policy, that could stimulate a recovery from a recession. Now, if the economy stagnates, that means there's not an increase in GDP. If the economy overheats, just to get used to this term, the way that it's used in this textbook, an overheated economy is one where aggregate demand is too far to the right and needs to be stopped from shifting to the right or even shifted back to the left. An overheated economy might cause inflation. These, again, are all things we're going to talk about in the following chapters. There was this tension between the classical economists and John Maynard Keynes. The classical economists, this is early 1900s now, Great Depression, advising our president, Herbert Hoover, we don't need to do anything, the system is flexible, prices are flexible, markets are flexible, it's a self-regulating system, this market system economy that we have, and so the economy will eventually fix itself. And John Maynard Keynes said, no, the government should step in. They can and they should step in because this is market failure. The system can experience market failure and the government should do something, in this case, to stimulate the economy. And then finally, as I said, people started listening to him. Keynesian theory is when the government does intervene in the operation of markets at times of market failure, like a depression or even a recession. And Keynesian theory is acting on the demand curve, trying to shift it to the right when there's a recession, or if the economy's overheated, shifting it to the left. So that would be decreasing aggregate demand. We'll be looking at both of those cases. We haven't had to do that in several decades because we haven't had an inflation problem in several decades, but that's when that would be called for. Monetary theory is the last thing we'll talk about in this course, really the last week of class in this semester. Monetary theory is when your central bank adjusts the size of the money supply, and this influences interest rates. And in short, the way to explain this is, if the central bank takes action to lower interest rates, then think of all the things that are part of aggregate demand that people buy with borrowed money. It affects those markets when the interest rates are changed. If the interest rate comes down, for example, people can afford a larger house. They can spend more money on the house, maybe $200,000 instead of $175,000 for the same monthly mortgage payment because interest rates have come down. And so they might buy that $200,000 house instead of the $175,000 house. Or it might even prompt them to buy a house instead of renting when they would otherwise consider continuing renting. So it affects the real estate market. It affects the market for new automobiles. People typically borrow the money to buy new automobiles or even used automobiles, and anything else, college education. Now, if the central bank takes action to increase interest rates, then that's going to decrease spending on all of these things. So again, these are all part of that aggregate demand curve. So if you are motivating people to buy more of these things or to spend more money on these types of products, then that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. If you're motivating them to spend less on these types of products, it shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. And here is showing you graphically. The graph on the left, imagine that we started at point capital E sub 0. That's the original equilibrium point. Now follow that down to the x-axis. You can see Q sub F. You know that Q sub F stands for full employment level of output. So that's GDP at 4% unemployment rate. Something happens in the economy and the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, and we end up at intersection point capital E sub 1. Now follow that down to the x-axis. Now we are producing less than the full employment level of output. If our goal is to get back to Q sub F, we need to take action to shift that aggregate demand curve back to the right. On the right, that graph shows you, again, if you're starting at point capital E sub 0 and you're at full employment level of output, and then something happens, or on its own the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, now you are producing more than the full employment level of output. And because of the shape of the aggregate supply curve, if unemployment is now less than 4%, which it must be, that's going to cause prices to rise. The reason for that is because you've reached the inflationary flashpoint. Producers, to satisfy aggregate demand, would need to acquire additional productive resources or pay for the use of additional productive resources like labor. But they can't find the workers because everybody's already working, because the unemployment rate is maybe 3.5% or 3.2%. So they can't, and so what they do instead is they raise the price. This will drive up prices, and so that causes inflation because, again, of the shape of the aggregate supply curve. Look at how that aggregate supply curve at this end of the curve is rising in slope, and you can see it's approaching some maximum level of GDP that you can kind of picture on this graph where that might be. Now, supply side theory is when you are acting on the supply curve. This is something that happened recently. Under the Trump administration, we lowered the corporate tax rate. When we lowered the corporate tax rate, it shifted the supply curve to the right. Aggregate supply shifted to the right. And again, that makes the intersection point horizontally move to the right and increase GDP, or that it works to do that. Other things equal. Of course, there's other things happening in the economy too. But other things equal, it will cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right and work to increase GDP. That's because it's making it less expensive for producers to produce their product. It's lowering their operating costs. We lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. By the way, Joe Biden is proposing increasing it to somewhere in between. He's proposing increasing it to 28%. So if the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, that's a good thing, right? If it shifts to the left, and this happened in the 1970s, caused by the oil shocks. The price of oil escalated really fast, tripled really quickly. And we were much more of a manufacturing-based economy at that time. And so this affected the cost of producing things. Manufacturers use a lot of energy to produce their product, and the price of oil affects the whole energy market, not just the market for oil. And so energy got more expensive. Well, that is a price of a resource that producers consume. This shifts the supply curve to the left. So now what do? Well, you can't fix this by shifting the demand curve. And I'll show you on the next slide why that is. So here is that example where we shifted from AS sub 0 to AS sub 1. So this is the oil shocks doing this. It's more expensive to produce your product because the cost of energy has risen so fast. Now, you can't fix this. Now look at the x-axis. Q sub f is far greater than Q sub 3, which is what you're now producing. That's the amount of GDP you're now producing now that the aggregate supply curve has shifted. You can't fix this situation by acting on the demand curve, can you? You might think, well, shift the aggregate demand curve to the right using fiscal policy or even monetary policy. Look what it would do to prices. The problem with the aggregate supply curve shifting to the left is a dual problem. We decreased GDP, plus we made prices rise from P0 to P3. And if you shift the demand curve to try to fix GDP, to horizontally move that intersection point to the right, problem is it makes prices rise even further. The only way to fix this problem is to act on the aggregate supply curve. And again, one of the ways to do this might be to do something to lower producers' costs, either lowering taxes on producers or building in some sort of tax incentive, or maybe funding them in some way, subsidizing them, the government subsidizing them. These would be fiscal policies that would attempt to shift that aggregate supply curve back to the right. Now, if you believe that in the short run, the economy is mostly stable, but at times exhibits instability and the government needs to step in and do something about it, let's think about long run. So in the short run, let's call that the next 6 to 9 to maybe 12 months. So a year or less. Let's say that's the short run. That's the short run planning horizon. The long run then, let's say, is longer than a year. So if there are any kind of economic policies, there are maybe short run implications and long run implications. Now the supply curve is an upward sloping curve, but only in the short run. Because think about what the main reason the supply curve is upward sloping is. It's upward sloping because producers will respond to rising prices by producing more, other things equal, just like in chapter 3. And the reason for that is because other things equal, if the price of your product is rising and nothing else is changing, including the costs of your resources, then that makes you more profitable. You'd want to produce more. In the long run, though, you lose that advantage. In the long run, as prices rise, if they continue to rise for a year, for example, or longer, then the costs of your resources are going to rise also. And if the cost of the reason they'll rise is because they're in more demand also. And all producers of whatever it is you produce are competing for more resources. This drives up the cost of your resources. And if the costs of your resources are rising as fast as the price of your product, there's no longer any particular incentive to produce more when prices are rising in the long run. So the supply curve is actually not upward sloping. It is a vertical line. The blue vertical line you see there is the long run aggregate supply curve. It is a vertical line. And Q sub n is the long run natural rate of output. That is the long run natural rate of GDP, or natural quantity of GDP, that our economy will produce, given that we have a certain capacity to our economy and we have a certain level of productivity of our productive resources, including labor. And so it will settle in at some natural rate of output in the long term. So producers, again, no longer have that incentive to produce more when the price of products rises, because their costs will rise too in the long run. Now we're interested in the short run. So we'll never draw the aggregate supply curve that way. We'll always show it as being upward sloping. Because the reason we're going through this whole process of developing this aggregate supply and aggregate demand model is so that we can understand the effects of fiscal policy and monetary policy. And fiscal policy and monetary policy seek to cause effects in the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months in the short term. So we're looking at short-run implications of economic policy mostly. And so that's why we're always going to draw the aggregate supply curve as an upward sloping curve like we have previously. And here it's explained that, we live in the short run. We are looking to fix the economy in the short run. We don't want to wait for more than a year for the economy to be affected by whatever actions we're taking. And so we're always going to show the aggregate supply curve as upward sloping. Before the current recession, the most recent recessions happened in the 2000s. So in 2001, when President George W. Bush was in office, and then we had recovery from that. That wasn't as serious a recession as we had in 2008 when Obama came into office, which extended through 2009. So let's talk about what the options were for these presidents, and then we'll talk about what they actually did. Now, this is where you need to increase GDP if it's a recession. So you can do that by shifting the aggregate demand curve. How might you do that? Fiscal policy is one option, and this would be by the government lowering taxes, which increases consumer spending, and or the government spending more money themselves, which stimulates the economy. That's one option. So that would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Monetary policy is where you would adjust the size of the money supply, which influences interest rates. And if you lower interest rates, that influences spending, makes people want to spend more money. And that would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So that was an option. They could have also used supply side policy, such as lowering taxes on producers or building in tax incentives. You could deregulate producers some, and that makes it less expensive for them to produce their product, and that would shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. And there's a few other things you could do. You could also use trade policy, and that was not a good option. You could do nothing. That's laissez-faire. Let the market self-adjust, and the government doesn't do anything. So what did they actually do? So what actually happened? Laissez-faire as a policy was never considered. That's the doing nothing policy. President Bush, so this was the smaller recession after 2001, after 9/11, he implemented a fiscal stimulus package that had an effect, and we were growing until the recession of 2008 through 2009 happened, and that was a much larger recession. President Obama implemented a massive fiscal stimulus package. It was considered massive until the current fiscal stimulus package, which was much larger than what Obama did. But this is a more serious recession and faster recession. But that drove up the deficit like a stimulus package will always do. We'll talk about that when we get to fiscal policy. But that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. It stops it from shifting to the left and shifts it to the right, which increases GDP. What about monetary policy? This is what your central bank might do. Increase the money supply, decrease the money supply, which makes it easier or harder to borrow money. So easy money policy means lowering interest rate and making it easy to get money. Tightening credit markets or tightening money policy is where you raise interest rates and make it harder for people to borrow money. We also bailed out companies and banks, which you may have learned about, especially if they were failing. And this did start shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. And as you're going to learn, the government, through their fiscal policy, doesn't have to fix the whole problem. They just have to create some momentum in growth. And then there's a multiplier effect that then happens that gets you the rest of the way. Now, the recovery was very slow, and it continued through this current recession.